That target isn't flying toward us, the old man said. The radar is dragging it across the sky. Every head inside the Patriot command shelter turned toward Walter Mercer. Green light washed over his weathered face, while warning tones pulsed through the cramped steel compartment. On the main display, an unidentified track moved steadily toward Fort Redstone at more than 600 miles per hour. It carried no transponder code. No flight plan matched it. No pilot had reported visual contact. Yet the system painted it clearly, a bright symbol advancing from the northeast with the calm certainty of something that believed it belonged there. Captain Ethan Cole looked from the screen to the old man, standing near the open door. Walt wore a faded field jacket, brown work boots, and no visible insignia. He had arrived 20 minutes earlier as a guest for the battalion's anniversary ceremony, then wandered close enough to hear the alarms. To Ethan, he looked like someone's grandfather who had taken a wrong turn. "Sir, this is a restricted operational area," Ethan said. "You need to step outside." Walt did not move. Beyond the shelter, the desert wind pushed dust across the launch site in long silver sheets. A flock of blackbirds crossed above the perimeter lights, then banked sharply as if they had struck an invisible wall. Walt watched them instead of the radar. Specialist Emily Hart tightened her headset. Air traffic control confirms clear skies within 80 miles. No civilian aircraft. No military traffic. Another operator spoke without looking up. Infrared station has no heat signature. Ethan's jaw hardened. Run identification again. Keys clicked. Cooling fans hummed. The radar continued tracking the impossible object. Range, 72 miles. Altitude, 19,000 feet. Speed, unchanged. System diagnostics are green, Emily said. All arrays responding normally. Ethan stared at the display. A machine could malfunction. A network could lag. But 3 independent checks had already returned clean. If the track was real, every second mattered. If it was false, treating it as real could shut down half the airspace in the state. "Notify brigade," he ordered. "Move the battery to elevated readiness." Red lights replaced the soft white lamps overhead. Outside, hydraulic systems stirred and generator engines deepened into a steady mechanical growl. Walt finally stepped closer to the doorway, though he kept his eyes on the birds. They had circled back. This time they climbed, dipped, and scattered along the same narrow line in the sky. "When did the track first appear?" he asked. Ethan turned slowly. "I told you to leave." "Was it before sunset?" Walt continued. "Or after the ground started cooling?" A young technician gave a nervous laugh. "Captain, is he seriously diagnosing a Patriot radar by birdwatching?" Ethan pointed toward the exit. "Sir, whatever systems you worked on 40 years ago, this is not one of them." Walt's expression remained still. He had heard that tone before, from officers who believed new equipment had made old mistakes impossible. On the display, the track suddenly climbed 6,000 feet without changing speed. Emily leaned toward her screen. "That doesn't make sense." Walt looked at the birds one last time. They folded their wings and dropped below the invisible boundary. At that exact moment, the target split into 2. The warning tone sharpened. Ethan froze. Walt spoke quietly, almost to himself. "There it is." The 2 tracks moved apart with mechanical precision, one climbing toward 25,000 feet, while the other dropped below 12,000. Specialist Emily Hart stared at the display, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Both tracks have identical speed and signal strength," she said. Captain Ethan Cole stepped closer. "That is not possible." The shelter seemed to tighten around them. Cooling fans pushed warm air through the equipment racks. Red warning lights pulsed against the steel walls. Outside, launcher crews waited beside their vehicles while the desert wind scraped dust across the concrete. Brigade command came over Ethan's headset, asking for classification. He looked at the clean diagnostic panel and gave the only answer the system supported. 2 unidentified airborne targets. Origin unknown. Walter Mercer remained near the doorway. His attention shifted between the dark sky and the thin ribbon of dust moving along the perimeter road. The blackbirds had regrouped on a power line beyond the fence. None of them appeared alarmed. They sat facing west, feathers pressed flat by the wind, as if waiting for something the people inside could not feel. "Run the secondary sensor correlation," Ethan ordered. Emily entered the command. A new set of symbols appeared, followed by a soft negative tone. "No infrared confirmation." No visual confirmation. No secondary radar return. But the primary radar still sees them, Ethan said. Clearly, replied the technician beside her. Range is now 61 miles. Ethan felt every eye in the shelter turn toward him. The responsibility rested on his rank, his training, and the bright symbols moving across the screen. The targets could be a test, an equipment fault, or something designed to look like both. A machine did not fear making the wrong decision. The person responsible for believing it did. Raise readiness another level, Ethan said. Keep the launchers on hold until we get confirmation. Walt finally looked away from the birds. Confirmation from what? Ethan pulled off one side of his headset. Sir, you are interfering with an active defense operation. You have one instrument telling you there are two objects, Walt said. Every other instrument says the sky is empty. The Patriot radar is designed to find what other systems miss. And when it makes a mistake, the young technician gave another strained laugh. The software filters out false returns. Walt's pale eyes settled on him. Software filters out what it has been taught to recognize. The words drained the humor from the room. Emily enlarged the first track. The altitude number jumped, steadied, then jumped again. Captain, Target 1 just climbed 4,000 feet in less than a second. Ethan studied the data. There was no corresponding change in speed, direction, or signal strength. No aircraft could move that way. Possible electronic interference, he said. Scan for jamming. The technician worked through the menu. No jamming detected. Walt moved one step into the shelter. What lies northeast of here? Open desert, Ethan answered. Beyond that, the interstate and a freight yard. Walt looked at the radar range, then at the birds. They suddenly lifted from the power line in a single dark wave. Instead of flying away, they rose sharply, crossed an invisible boundary, and dropped again. On the screen, both targets changed altitude at the same instant. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. Captain, she whispered. The old man knew when they would move. Ethan turned toward Walt. For the first time, there was no impatience in his face. Only uncertainty. Walt reached into his jacket and removed a small leather notebook, its edges softened by decades of use. Show me the raw return, he said. Not what the computer thinks it saw. Ethan held Walter's gaze for a long second, then looked toward Emily. Can you access the unprocessed return? Emily nodded, though her expression tightened. Yes, sir, but it will remove the classification overlays. Do it. The main display flickered. The clean symbols vanished, replaced by a field of grainy light, faint bands, and shifting echoes that looked almost meaningless to everyone except Walter. He stepped closer, opened the leather notebook, and turned to a page filled with hand-drawn arcs, dates, temperatures, and wind directions. The young technician beside Emily leaned back in his chair. What is that supposed to be? Walter did not answer. His eyes moved across the raw signal with the same patience he had shown the birds. Ethan watched him trace one thin line with a weathered finger. You worked on radar? He asked. A long time ago. What kind? The kind that made mistakes before computers learned to hide them. The technician gave a quiet scoff. This system does not hide mistakes. It corrects them. Walter looked at him. Then why are you tracking two targets that are not there? The question landed harder than any raised voice. Emily enlarged the northeast sector. Beneath the bright return was a faint smear stretching toward the freight yard more than 50 miles away. It appeared, faded, and appeared again. Walter checked his wristwatch, then turned toward the open door. The blackbirds were circling. Lower now. Dust moved in separate layers across the desert, one close to the ground and another several feet above it, both traveling in different directions. What was the temperature at sunset? Walter asked. Emily pulled up the weather record. 88 degrees. And now? 64. Ground temperature? She checked another sensor. Still above 80. Walter nodded once. Ethan crossed his arms. Explain what you think you are seeing. Walter pointed toward the faint smear. Warm air near the ground. Cooler air above it. The signal is bending along the boundary. Atmospheric refraction, Emily said. The system compensates for that, the technician replied. Walter turned a page in his notebook. It compensates for the conditions it was given, not necessarily the conditions outside this shelter. Ethan's patience returned in a sharper form. You are asking me to doubt a fully tested defense system because birds change direction. No, Walter said. I am asking you to notice that the birds, the dust, and the raw return are all telling you the same thing. Ethan stepped closer until only the console separated them. And who exactly are you to make that call? The room went still. Walter closed the notebook. Walter Mercer. No rank. No explanation. Just the name. Ethan searched his memory and found nothing. That does not answer my question. It is the only answer you need. The technician shook his head. Sir, we are losing time. On the display, the two false tracks merged, accelerated, then separated again. Emily's eyes widened. They just crossed the same coordinates without changing signal strength. Walter looked toward the northeast. Because neither one is moving. The reflection point is. Ethan followed his gaze, but saw only darkness. Walter pointed to the raw display. In less than 20 seconds, the upper return will drop 3,000 feet. The technician started to object. Ethan raised one hand. Everyone watched the altitude readout. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. At 19 seconds, the number fell exactly 3,000 feet. No one spoke. Walter opened the notebook again. Now, he said, we can stop pretending I do not belong in this room. The silence lasted only a moment, but it changed the room. Captain Ethan Cole looked at the altitude history, then at Walter Mercer, as if the old man had stepped out of a story Ethan had never believed. You predicted one movement, Ethan said. That does not prove the tracks are false. Walter rested both hands on the edge of the console. Then look at all three things the system cannot explain. Emily turned toward him. Walter pointed to the first track. The altitude changes, but the speed remains exactly the same. A real aircraft would show a change in energy, angle, or signal shape. This does not. His finger moved to the second track. Both returns appear whenever the birds cross the same strip of air northeast of the battery. The young technician frowned. Birds do not control radar signals. No, Walter said. They reveal the air the signal is passing through. He pointed toward the open door. The flock had formed a loose circle above the perimeter road. Each time the birds climbed toward a certain height, they banked west and dropped several hundred feet, as though a clear ceiling had pressed them downward. And the third thing? Ethan asked. Walter looked at the weather display. They are not reacting to an object. If something large were moving through their path, they would scatter away from it. They are following a temperature boundary. Emily studied the raw return again. The strongest echo is not centered on either track, she said. It is stretched underneath them. Walter nodded. Because the radar is not tracking something in the sky. It is receiving a reflection from the ground, bent upward, and returned along a path the computer classifies as airborne. The technician folded his arms. That would require an unusually strong inversion layer. Walter looked through the doorway at the dust moving in two directions. You have one. Ethan walked to the shelter entrance. Cold air touched his face, but the concrete outside still released the day's heat. Beyond the fence, headlights moved along the interstate. Farther northeast, tall freight cranes stood beneath white industrial lamps. He turned back toward the display. You believe we are tracking the freight yard? Part of it, Walter said. Metal, lights, moving railcars. The reflection changes shape, and the system builds a target from each shift. Ethan's headset crackled. Brigade Command requested an updated threat assessment. The range had fallen below 50 miles. The symbols continued advancing, indifferent to the argument around them. Ethan pressed the headset closer. Assessment pending. Maintain current readiness. A voice asked whether he recommended weapons release authority. Ethan looked at the screen. Every formal procedure told him to trust the radar until another sensor disproved it. Every other sensor had already done exactly that. Walter watched him carefully. Machines give certainty faster than people earn it, he said. That is why certainty is dangerous. Ethan lowered the headset. We are moving to full readiness. Emily turned sharply. Captain, the returns have no physical confirmation. And we do not dismiss a possible threat because one guest has a theory. Walter's face remained calm, but disappointment settled behind his eyes. Outside, the launcher generators rose to a deeper hum. Red lamps flashed across the site. Ethan pointed toward the door. Mr. Mercer, you have made your observation. Now step away from the operational area. Walter closed his notebook, but he did not leave. He looked at the birds, then at the clock above the display. In 40 seconds, he said, both targets will turn south without changing speed. When they do, You will have to decide whether you are defending this base from an aircraft or from your own screen. 37 seconds passed before the first track began to bend south. The second followed 3 seconds later, matching its turn without losing a single mile per hour. No one inside the shelter spoke. Captain Ethan Cole stared at the display as the two symbols curved together with impossible symmetry. The warning tone pulsed again, low and steady, and something in its rhythm reached through the years for Walter Mercer. The steel walls faded. The green light became the dim glow of another radar room under another desert sky. Walter was 31 again, standing beside a humming console while sand whispered against the outer panels. The equipment was older, louder, and less forgiving. Every relay clicked like a nervous clock. Every signal had to be questioned by the people watching it. A bright return had appeared beyond the northern boundary shortly after midnight. It moved at the speed of a transport aircraft and carried no identifying code. The duty officer, a young captain named Daniel Reeves, immediately ordered the crew to prepare a response. Daniel was intelligent, ambitious, and certain the screen had given him the entire truth. Walter had watched the return climb without changing shape. He had noticed dust moving east near the ground while a weather balloon drifted west several thousand feet above it. Outside the bunker, a flock of desert birds stayed low and followed a dry wash instead of crossing open ground. The signs did not agree with the radar. Walter had asked for 5 minutes to compare the raw return with the temperature readings. Daniel had given him 30 seconds. The track split. One symbol became 3, then 5. The room filled with voices, ringing telephones, and the sharp language of men trying to make certainty from confusion. Walter ignored the processed display and studied the weak smear beneath it. The signal was folding over a layer of cold air, striking a convoy more than 60 miles away, then returning as though the vehicles were moving through the sky. He had reached across the console and changed the elevation scan before Daniel could stop him. The targets vanished. A moment later, they reappeared below ground level, their impossible position exposing the error. The room had gone silent. Daniel never forgot that night. Neither did Walter. Years later, during another assignment, Daniel had trusted a clean screen over an experienced operator's warning. The mistake did not create a dramatic headline. It created an empty chair at a reunion and a folded flag delivered to a quiet house in Ohio. Walter had carried that memory longer than he had carried any rank. The present returned with a rush of warm air from the equipment fans. Ethan was still staring at the southbound tracks. Emily Hart looked from the display to Walter's face. "You have seen this before," she said. Walter's hand rested on the leather notebook. "I have seen what happens when a room decides the screen cannot be wrong." Ethan's expression tightened, but the arrogance had left it. "What did you do then?" "I tested the part of the story the machine could not explain." Walter opened the notebook to a page dated more than 4 decades earlier. A hand-drawn curve crossed the paper beside notes about temperature, wind, and signal angle. The shape was nearly identical to the raw return glowing in front of them. Ethan read the faded numbers, then looked at the current data. For the first time, he understood that Walter had not guessed. He had remembered. Outside, the blackbirds dropped below the unseen layer again. On the screen, both tracks descended at the same instant. Walter closed the notebook softly. "Give me 90 seconds, he said. "Then you can decide whether to trust me." Captain Ethan Cole checked the clock above the display. "You have 90 seconds. Walter Mercer moved beside Emily Hart without ceremony. "Shift the elevation scan down by 2 degrees, he said. The young technician turned toward Ethan. "Captain, changing the scan profile during elevated readiness is outside procedure." "I know the procedure," Ethan replied. "Make the change." Emily entered the command. The raw return stretched across the screen, its bright upper edge thinning as the radar beam tilted closer to the horizon. Walter watched the moving grain, not the target symbols. "Now remove the automatic ground clutter filter from the northeast sector." The technician shook his head. "That filter is there for a reason. Without it, the display will fill with roads, buildings, and every moving object on the ground." Walter kept his voice calm. "That is exactly what we need to see." Ethan looked at the range counter. The 2 tracks were less than 40 miles away. Brigade Command spoke through his headset again, asking for a final classification. "Hold for 1 minute," Ethan answered. "We are conducting a sensor verification." The technician disabled the filter. The display bloomed with hundreds of weak returns. Highway traffic formed a thin, moving chain. Freight cars appeared as pulsing blocks near the industrial yard. The false airborne tracks remained above them, bright and steady. Walter placed one finger on the freight yard return. Mark that location. Emily did. Now compare its movement with the upper track. She opened both histories. The pattern seemed unrelated at first. Then a freight train slowed on a curved section of rail. At the same instant, the first airborne track appeared to turn. Emily leaned closer. They match. Not exactly, the technician said. The timing is off by almost 2 seconds. Walter nodded. Because the signal is traveling along a longer path. 38 seconds remained. Walter asked Emily to change the scan angle again. The first track vanished. The second dropped below the horizon line, then reappeared at a negative altitude. A warning box flashed across the display, unable to classify an airborne object more than 1,000 feet beneath the desert floor. The technician stopped arguing. That cannot be a real target. No, Walter said. It never was. Ethan looked at the clock. 25 seconds. Can you prove it to Brigade? Walter pointed at the fixed water tower near the freight yard. Use that as a reference. If the atmosphere is bending the beam, its return will shift when you change elevation. Emily selected the tower and adjusted the scan. The return moved nearly half a degree without the structure moving an inch. The calculation appeared beneath it. Atmospheric path distortion exceeded the system model. Emily exhaled. There it is. Ethan pressed his headset. Brigade, this is Patriot control. Both tracks are confirmed false returns caused by severe atmospheric refraction. Recommend reducing readiness pending continued verification. The response came after a tense pause. Recommendation accepted. Outside, the launcher generators softened. The red warning lamps stopped flashing. Inside, relief moved through the shelter, but Walter did not share it. He studied the distortion value, then looked at the green maintenance status on the adjacent panel. Something else is wrong, he said. Ethan removed his headset. You just proved the targets are false. I proved what created them. Walter tapped the calibration reading. A properly aligned system should have recognized this distortion before it built 2 tracks. Emily checked the last maintenance entry. The radar array had been recalibrated 3 days earlier. Every test had passed. Walter looked toward the dark line of birds beyond the fence. The ghost is gone, he said, but the door that let it in is still open. Ethan studied the calibration panel while Emily opened the maintenance log. The system passed every verification 3 days ago, she said. Walter Mercer leaned closer to the screen. Who performed the alignment? The young technician pulled up the entry. A contractor team in our maintenance section. The array was within tolerance. Walter looked through the open shelter door. The birds had settled again, but only below the same invisible boundary. Above them, the sky appeared empty and calm. Tolerance is not the same as truth, he said. Emily compared the current distortion with the values recorded after maintenance. A narrow column of numbers showed a difference so small that the software had marked it green. There is a directional offset of 0.2 degrees, she said. Ethan frowned. That is inside the accepted range. Walter shook his head. Not when the atmosphere bends the beam in the same direction. One small error joins another, and the computer builds confidence from both. He asked Emily to display the calibration data by sector instead of averaging the entire array. The screen changed. Most sectors remained stable. The northeast segment showed a faint repeating drift. It rose, fell, then returned to normal every 11 seconds. The technician stared at it. That was not visible in the summary. A summary tells you what is convenient, Walter said. A pattern tells you what is happening. He moved toward the equipment rack and listened. Cooling fans hummed. Relays clicked in an even rhythm. Then, beneath the steady machinery, came a softer sound. A brief metallic tremor. It returned 11 seconds later. Walter placed 2 fingers against the side panel. There, Ethan heard. Nothing at first. On the 3rd cycle, he caught it. A faint vibration passed through the housing as the radar completed part of its scan. What is that? He asked. Walter looked at the maintenance record. Something was tightened to specification while the assembly was cold. Now it is warm, and the mount is shifting under load. The technician opened the component diagram. That support bracket is behind the phase control module. The system would flag any movement large enough to matter. It is flagging it, Walter said. You taught it to call the flag green. Emily overlaid the 11-second vibration cycle with the directional drift. The peaks aligned perfectly. Ethan's face changed. The problem was no longer an old man's theory. It was measurable. Shut down the northeast segment for inspection, he ordered. The technician hesitated. Tomorrow's evaluation begins at sunrise. If we open that housing, we may not restore full capability in time. Walter looked at the eastern horizon, where the darkness had begun to thin. If you leave it closed, the radar may show you something that is not there again. Or worse, it may fail to show you something that is. Ethan held the technician's gaze. Open it. Locks released with heavy clicks. When the panel came free, warm air rolled from the compartment. Emily aimed a flashlight inside. One mounting bracket sat slightly crooked, its polished edge marked by a narrow line where metal had shifted against metal. The movement was less than the width of a thumbnail. It was enough. Emily looked back at Walter. You found it without touching the radar. Walter closed his notebook. The birds touched the air. The air touched the signal. The signal told us where to look. Ethan watched the old man in the green console glow, and for the first time wondered why the name Walter Mercer felt as though it belonged in a history he should have known. Emily kept her flashlight fixed on the crooked bracket while the technician documented the fault. Ethan stood behind them, silent, his earlier certainty replaced by something heavier. He opened the unit archive on a secondary terminal and typed Walter Mercer's name. The first search returned. Nothing. The second returned a restricted record marked with an old Air Defense Command seal. Specialist Hart, Ethan said. Try the historical personnel database. Emily entered the name again. A faded photograph appeared beside a file that had not been opened in years. The man in the picture was younger, leaner, and dressed in a flight jacket, but the eyes were the same. Pale, steady, and impossible to rush. Beneath the photograph were 3 words. Chief Warrant Officer. Ethan read the service dates, then stopped when he reached the operations section. Most of it was sealed. One line remained visible. Primary author, Atmospheric Anomaly Recognition Protocol. Emily looked at Walter, then back at the screen. You wrote the procedure we use for false track verification. Walter did not turn around. I helped write it. It has your name on it. Names get removed from useful things faster than mistakes do. Before Ethan could answer, the shelter door opened. Brigadier General Thomas Keene stepped inside without an escort. His uniform was immaculate, but the speed of his arrival showed in the dust along his boots. Everyone straightened. Walter did not. He was still looking into the open equipment housing. Keene stopped 3 feet behind him. For a long moment, the general said nothing. Then his voice softened. Watchman. Walter's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. He turned. The years between the 2 men seemed to gather in the green light. Tom Keene, Walter said. No rank. No ceremony. Just the name of someone remembered from another life. Keene gave a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. I was told there was a radar anomaly. Nobody mentioned they had brought in the man who taught half the army how to recognize one. The technician lowered his eyes. Ethan stood rigid beside the console. Keene looked at the open panel, the shifted bracket, and the raw returns still frozen on the display. Who found the fault? He asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. Chief Mercer did, sir. Walter shook his head. The birds found the air layer. Specialist Hart found the pattern. Your people opened the housing. Keene looked at Emily. And who listened first? Emily glanced at Ethan before answering. Not soon enough, sir. Keene nodded as if that answer mattered more than praise. He stepped closer to Walter. Do you remember Fort Calder? Walter's expression grew distant. I remember the cold. I remember you arguing with a scope trace for 6 hours. You stopped me from making the worst decision of my career. You were 24. I was certain. Walter looked toward Ethan. That is usually when people are most dangerous. Ethan accepted the words without defense. General Keene turned to the crew. Chief Mercer's atmospheric recognition protocol has been part of our training for decades. Most of you have read it. None of you were told who wrote it because the original file came from a restricted program. The room went still. Keene faced Walter and raised his hand in a formal salute. Ethan followed. Then Emily. Then the technician. One by one, the entire shelter came to attention. Walter looked uncomfortable beneath the weight of their respect. He returned the salute slowly. Fix the bracket, he said. Sunrise will not wait for us. The repair took 43 minutes. By the time the phase control module was secured and the crooked bracket replaced, the eastern horizon had turned from black to deep blue. The desert wind softened. Generator noise settled into a steady hum. Inside the shelter, Emily Hart completed the final calibration while Ethan Cole watched every number without assuming green meant perfect. Walter Mercer stood near the open door with his leather notebook tucked beneath one arm. General Thomas Keene remained behind the crew, offering no orders and no speeches. The system would speak for itself. Calibration complete, Emily said. All sectors aligned. Ethan studied the raw return before allowing the process display to appear. The northeast sector remained clear. No stretch smear. No impossible altitude changes. No bright symbols advancing from an empty sky. Outside, the blackbirds lifted from the power line and crossed the perimeter in a single dark ribbon. This time they climbed without turning away. Walter watched them pass through the same layer that had trapped them earlier. The inversion is breaking, he said. Minutes later, the scheduled evaluation began. A target aircraft entered the exercise corridor 80 miles west of the battery. The radar found it at once. Its speed changed naturally as it climbed. Its signal shape remained stable. Infrared confirmation arrived. Secondary sensors matched the track. Every part of the picture agreed. Ethan followed the data carefully, checking the sky, the weather, and the raw return before speaking. Target confirmed. Track is valid. General Keene gave a small nod. The evaluation continued without a single false return. When it ended, sunlight had reached the shelter floor. The red lamps were dark, and the screens glowed softly in the morning light. Ethan removed his headset and approached Walter. The crew grew quiet. "Chief Mercer," he said, "I treated your experience like it had expired. I was wrong." Walter looked at him for a moment. "You trusted what you were trained to trust. I stopped listening when the evidence challenged it." Ethan glanced toward Emily. "That could have cost us more than an evaluation." Walter opened his notebook and placed it on the console. The pages held decades of weather patterns, signal curves, handwritten warnings, and small observations most people would never think to record. "Keep this with the unit," he said. Ethan looked down at it. "This belongs to you." It belonged to the work. Now the work belongs to you. Emily carefully turned one page. Beside an old atmospheric diagram, Walter had written a sentence in faded pencil. "A clean screen can still carry a dirty assumption." Ethan read it twice. General Keene stepped beside Walter as the crew returned to their stations. "You could stay for the ceremony," he said. Walter shook his head. "They have what they need." He walked toward the door, his boots quiet against the metal floor. No one stopped him. No one needed to. Outside, the birds crossed the pale morning sky while the radar followed the real aircraft far beyond them. For once, the screen and the world told the same story. Ethan stood beside Emily and watched Walter disappear across the sunlit concrete. Then he looked up before looking back at the display. Technology had not failed them. Pride had nearly kept them from seeing what it was trying to say. Some lessons arrive through manuals. Others return with weathered hands, an old notebook, and the patience to watch the sky.